At Tech for Good Southwest, we're passionate about building momentum for the Tech for Good movement across the southwest of the UK. Our mission is to amplify the positive impact of technology in tackling societal challenges and creating stronger, fairer and more connected communities. By fostering a regional Tech for Good community, we aim to support initiatives that ensure technology serves the greater good and enable everyone to thrive in the long term. Throughout this podcast, we'll be joined by a diverse range of voices from across the tech sector, charities, investors, startups and community-driven projects as they share their stories, challenges and hopes in harnessing tech for good. Join us as we explore a world of tech for good right here in the Southwest. Brought to you by Annie, Alicia and Arielle.
Welcome to the Tech for Good Southwest podcast. I'm your host, Arielle Tai, and today I'm joined by Mary Stevens, Experiments Programme Manager at Friends of the Earth. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, great to be here.
Great to have you here. Mary's background spans public policy, social action and research, with a focus on systems thinking for environmental action and community-led change. More recently, she's been exploring how AI could be used to advance environmental justice. Now, we've been chatting about this hugely topical area because while there's the potential of AI to drive positive change, there are also serious questions about its risks and impacts on the environment. So let's dive straight in, Mary. Please, if you could just tell me a bit more about your role and how you've been exploring this topic.
Thanks. It's a big topic, isn't it, to dive straight into. So I've been at Friends of the Earth since 2018, and actually we've been thinking in my team, which is basically an innovation team. We're a very small team, but we've been thinking about this issue, really since 2018. So for quite a long time now. And one of the reasons we do that is because we think it's really important for a campaigning organisation like Friends of the Earth to have a team that is looking a little bit beyond where the mainstream of the organisation is looking. So thinking about kind of the risks and opportunities that might kind of be coming down the track. Part of our work involves kind of horizon scanning and trend spotting. See, one of the things that was on the horizon even back in 2018 was the use and the applications of AI. And obviously since 2022 roughly, this is, kicked off again with the rise almost seemingly out of nowhere of kind of generative AI and large language models and so on. So we've been working, amongst other things, we've been working on this topic for quite a while. We had some funding. We were very lucky to secure some funding from something called the Green Screen Coalition via the Mozilla Foundation to do a bit of an in-depth dive into the relationship between AI and environmental justice and to think about some principles and practice recommendations for civil society, basically that brought together these two issues. And that was a project that we did also in collaboration with the wonderful people at We Are Open, who we co-authored that piece with. So that's really been a springboard for thinking in a bit more depth around, what these issues that you spoke about might mean for campaigning organizations like ourselves, smaller organizations, social enterprises, civil society organizations.
Thank you. And it is, I think when we were talking before, it's such an important topic that so many organizations that I'm working with are grappling with. And you mentioned the report that you put together. So it's called Harnessing AI for Environmental Justice. And in there, you talk about this narrative between AI will fix all of our problems or it's going to lead to societal collapse. There's this sort of utopian versus dystopian, I think you describe it as, narrative that's going on. And that in your report, you say that you aim to create a new story for AI that's somewhere in between this dystopia and utopia. Can you tell me more about this?
Yes, I think this, this polarity between sort of dystopian and utopian visions is something that we're actually all pretty familiar with. So, I mean, I think this has changed a little bit, but a couple of years ago when you started talking about AI, the images that immediately came to mind was sort of, the Terminator and those kinds of things, it's kind of AGI taking over the world and the robots in control. And even when we had UK government talking about AI risk and so on, they kind of actually it felt like a lot of the risks that they seem to have in mind were around these kind of, artificial general intelligence and robot takeover risks. And, lots of people, not just ourselves, but lots of people were saying, back then, actually, this isn't about some kind of future risk. There are some very real existential risks involved in the rollout of AI for communities, right now at the sharp end of that, whether that's at the sharp end of kind of mineral extraction, whether that's communities that are experiencing kind of bias and discrimination through the application of AI systems that they then, and no accountability for that and so on. So, so there's the dystopian side. And then, and then the flip side to that, I think, is that we've also seen a lot of narrative, again, a narrative driven by a different facet of big tech that has been very much about, AI is going to be brilliant because it's going to solve the climate crisis, it's going to cure cancer, it's going to do, it's going to lead us to these kind of sunlit uplands, when actually what we see when you look into it a little bit more is that, yes, there are some fantastic applications of AI for all sorts of for these different research agendas, that there are lots of ways in which, AI is supporting, climate modeling or medical research or whatever, but that actually only really represents a fraction of how the technology is being used. But it's a very useful narrative for big tech to promote, when actually also underlying that narrative is sometimes this suggestion that AI is going to be so useful, it's going to solve all our problems, that the best thing we can do is just crack on with it, and then it'll figure out how to mop up the damage afterwards. And of course, the climate doesn't work like that. We like the damage will be done, and when the climate and in particular, our living world ecosystems don't work like that. You can't repair the damage necessarily afterwards. You've got to stop the damage happening in the first place. So, you know, it's this very polarized narrative that is coming essentially out of Silicon Valley, and has been, and is then repeated, I think, by the big players in the tech industry and by kind of those people championing that narrative in government. But I do think there is scope for kind of other types of story within this. I think we need a story about AI that literally brings it back down to earth. So I'm very interested in how the AI systems that the technology systems that we use, more generally, have kind of physical materiality. They are warehouses and cables and metals and, and land and water and all these things. And there are also people who make these things, people who use these things, people who are impacted by these things. So I think, first of all, that story needs to kind of bring it back down from the cloud, if you like, and ground it in our physical reality. And then I think actually we need to grow a story about a different kind of relationship with AI, one in which we figure out how we as humans can work in kind of productive and useful collaboration with AI, but in a way that aligns these technologies with in a way that is values led, and aligns these technologies with the world that we're trying to grow, and kind of and continually ask questions about whether they are serving that purpose or not. Um, and I think that narrative is that narrative that is less polarized and that has curiosity at its heart is for the most part really lacking.
It's such a challenge, these two sides that you talk about. And I feel like you've really articulated well how so many charities and tech for good organizations are feeling. There is this massive fear that if we don't just crack on, we are going to be left behind as a sector. We've got limited resources, and the thought that AI can actually speed up your processes and, really be able to expand your impact is really, really exciting. Whilst at the same time, so many organizations are really concerned about these risks and the environmental impact, but they don't really have the resource or time, or, it's a huge topic to explore. Um, and they are concerned about these technologies doing more harm than good. So where do you think that balance lies between this experimentation, making sure that we're not falling behind, but also this caution for these organizations?
It's such a dilemma, isn't it? And I'm always reminded of what the technologist Rachel Caldicott has to say about this, where she talks about, always worth remembering that kind of FOMO, fear of missing out, is not a strategy. And I think sometimes we feel like, very driven by this fear of missing out and getting left behind. And one of the questions that I always find myself asking is kind of, well, yeah, but left behind on the way to where? So whenever we're thinking about these things, we need to think about, well, do we want to repeat this narrative of, our development being kind of a race to somewhere? Do there have to be winners and losers? Yeah, what does missing out actually look like? So first of all, I think we kind of need to question that a little bit, and question the values and the narrative that are underlying that, because actually it really suits the narrative of the big tech companies to position this as a kind of, you've got to get on board, otherwise you're gonna get left out. And I think I'm really sympathetic to, and I really understand where that anxiety and where that narrative comes from. But I think also we need to be kind of mindful about what we're choosing to adopt, and what we might also be losing out on or leaving behind, in a rush. The second thing I would say about this, and I think this is a really important point from my perspective, is I have a lot of empathy for kind of small organizations, small SMEs, small charities, where you've got a small team of people really committed to a cause, really committed to making change in their communities or whatever their chosen cause is, and tearing their hair out over whether they should be, how they should be approaching these technologies. And I really feel like actually the tech sector has done this kind of incredible job at pushing all this sort of guilt and responsibility onto individual consumer choice. So people are trying to figure out, how many liters of water in my chat GPT search? What does mindful use look for me? How can I make sure that my technology that this uses is kind of sustainable as it possibly could be? And while these are all worthy questions, actually, I think there's a really fundamental design problem. So we shouldn't be having to make these choices as organizations of 3 or 4 people. We should be able to be choosing technologies with confidence that are, effectively labeled for their energy efficiency, that are transparent about their water use, where we can make informed decisions based on actually design choices that should be being made higher up the kind of the pipe. And I think we see this with lots of technology actually, where, there's been, and the fossil fuel industry has been a kind of masters of this, of pushing it all onto individuals and their carbon footprint without actually placing the emphasis on the kind of systems change that needs to happen, and then kind of making people feel guilty about what they're doing and whatever. And this is a classic systems change problem. We've got we have got a system, a technology system, a data system that is absolutely designed for, in its current form, for funneling and channeling profits into the hands of a tiny, tiny number of people, essentially, a tiny number of tech billionaires, um, whilst at the same time making, people who are, I don't know, trying to run a community art project in South Wales or whatever it might be, actually kind of their consciences are racked by, should I be using this technology, or should I not be using this technology? And the power imbalance there is all the wrong way around. And I think we really need to be placing a lot more emphasis on big tech to clean up its act, rather than kind of actually feeling too guilty about what is probably quite modest use at the level of organizations and individuals. Now, we can come on to this, and it doesn't mean that I don't think there are things that people can do. I think there are lots of things that people can do. But I also think that it's really important to remember where the responsibility lies. We're placing too much the burden of responsibility on those individual users. And, inevitably, those of us who work in the not-for-profit sector broadly, or the kind of, the social impact sector, are likely to feel that tension even more acutely, because actually we're led by, all our work is about our values. We're led by our values. So we worry about these kinds of things. And that actually has a disproportionate effect, I think, on people in the sector, and prevents people from making technology choices that actually might increase their impact. So I think we really do need to think about it as a systemic issue. I would then, you talked about the balance between kind of experimentation and caution. There will be a different answer to this question for every organization, depending on your risk appetite and what your risks are. Um, and I think what's needed then is within each organization, a kind of clear, plain English policy about what your approach is, what kind of risks you're comfortable with, and what kind of risks you feel less comfortable with. And that is very much led by your values. So, if your values are all about let's say your values are all about, respecting the input of respecting people's creativity, valuing people for their work, then you might well choose to have a policy which is like, actually, we're not going to do any image generation, for example, because we know that that is displacing people's jobs and whatever. That's just an example, something you might choose to do that's values led. But there might be other areas where you're quite happy to experiment, where perhaps other organizations might be more cautious. I do also think that experimentation is really important. So one of the principles, the first principle that we talk about in our report is the principle of curiosity. That actually, because when we are curious about these systems, we start to understand what their limits are, what their potential is, and it actually, I think, makes us better place to engage with kind of advocating for and building better systems if we kind of know how they have a bit of a sense of how they work, what they can do from us and kind of do for us, and kind of unlock the black box a bit. I do think we need to, and I know this won't be everybody's view. I know there are, definitely other people who are more in the kind of, actually, we need to think about modes of resistance and decomputing or whatever. But I think for most people, there's kind of mindful, curious experimentation, so you can really understand the opportunities in a kind of controlled way without kind of throwing everything at it too quickly, but exploring in a managed way in discrete use cases what the benefits might be is a really good way to proceed, and kind of learning through kind of testing, iterating, reflecting, making sure you have that reflective cycle, um, is probably the right way to proceed.
Wow, there's just so much. You've just got so much amazing information that I think is just so relevant to charities, third sector organizations, tech for good focused organizations. And I really like that sort of emphasis. And it comes out in the report as well around, where that responsibility lies. And we will talk a little bit more about sort of advocacy and some of the things that perhaps we can collectively do to address that issue more. You did start already mentioning some practical things that, organizations can do to use AI responsibly. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those things?
It's really important to start with your organizational values and think about how you translate those into technology use. At Friends of the Earth, just to give some examples, we've got some, in addition to the principles that are kind of in our report, when it comes to our kind of internal adoption, we do have some specific principles that we're thinking about. The absolutely critical one that we're trying to adopt is this idea, we're calling it just enough AI. It comes from the idea of kind of just enough internet, which is also an idea that has been kind of pioneered and championed by Rachel Caldicott. In other places, some people talk about digital sufficiency, for example. But actually, what can we do to favor? Are there ways in which we can kind of favor the smallest application of AI to kind of meet the needs? We're not saying don't do it, but we're saying actually just think about what does just enough to get us to the place we need to get to look like. And so some of the questions we ask ourselves are things like, okay, well, if the AI route perhaps reduces the sort of manual effort for a task by about 75% roughly, or at least that, and significantly reduces the kind of compute energy. I mean, we're kind of user estimating for that, but significantly reduces the compute energy, then it might well be worth doing, actually. So yeah, so some things to think about. This kind of just enough AI approach. Um, Again, this would be one that's very common to a lot of people, but they're kind of the human in the loop approach. So actually, when you're thinking about responsible use, making sure that if there's a high risk decision point, if there's something public facing, then there is a human always involved in reviewing and assessing any outputs. A really important one for us is that we will never use AI we'll never use AI for any sort of automated for recruitment, for any sort of automated, certainly not for any kind of automated recruitment decisions. And we will not be using AI for anything like kind of productivity surveillance or anything. Like, I mean, you might be able to take these for granted, but other people might be starting to do that, and it might be starting to creep in. So thinking about, okay, well, what are your red lines? What is really important to you? We have a really wonderful kind of creative team who produce amazing kind of graphics and whatever. Again, it's really important that our voice is an authentic voice, because actually our voice is about empowering local grassroots communities to take action. It's really important people know that when they are seeing images from us, they are not generated by AI or anything like that. So we absolutely have some red lines about that kind of usage as well, for all sorts of reasons, both protecting creatives and actually kind of protecting the value and the authenticity of our work, of our voice. And actually, and there are other things that people might think about, like open disclosure. So actually, when AI has been used in, if you've used AI to write a report or write an article or something, actually, can you explain, well, actually, for example, AI was used in the in the early stage information gathering to look into sources or whatever. Say what you do, be explicit about it, so that you've kind of you're building trust, and you're kind of retaining the trust of your audience. I think that's a really important kind of some of those steps are really important kind of practical mindful uses. There's also, I think, things that people can do that speak more to the advocacy side. So actually, like, as all organizations, if you are procuring services, if you're procuring technology services, then you have a lot of power, actually, because you can ask the providers of those services, well, what do you know about where your software is hosted? What do you know about what do you know about the carbon footprint, the energy footprint, the water, whatever, the servers where your software is hosted? um you can ask those questions in procurement. And those are questions you can ask around things when you're not just in AI services. Those are also questions you can ask, and I'm sure you've talked about this lots before. Those are also questions you can ask around things like web design, for example. How are you minimizing the impact of your web design and and hosting? And people won't always have answers to those questions. Sometimes they won't have answers to those questions because there is a gap around reporting, and actually we know very little about water usage and so on. But actually, there's a power in just asking the questions. And part of responsible usage, I think, comes down to actually asking, being being conscious of what you can influence, where you might be able to exercise some influence, and using that when you can, in things like procurement.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting listening to, I suppose, how many different elements there are to this whole conversation. Because I really feel like since AI, actually, it's brought into our focus a little bit more this idea about having a digital footprint. Whereas actually, every time we send an email, we store something in the cloud, we have a digital footprint. But it seems like with AI, it's highlighted the issue to us much more because of
Mm,
the massive amount of, data and cooling the data centers and all of this sort of extra cost on the environment. But actually, it's making us perhaps thinking a little bit more about our impact on the whole in terms of our digital footprint. And I know you were talking to me last time we spoke around having that, I think you called it like a data hygiene day or a digital hygiene day, where you get together with your team and you just delete loads of different things. Do you need to store these? Interestingly, after our conversation, some of my team started looking into, and it wasn't due to this, it was just sort of by coincidence. They started looking into the fact that some of the way that our systems are set up, it doesn't actually delete emails when you delete them, it still sort of stores them in a deleted inbox. And they contacted then the IT department to say, can we please make sure these are fully deleted after 30 days? And even though that seems like a small thing, it's actually like, again, making maybe us all thinking a bit more around what are our policies in terms of this.
That's a great example. And yes, I think I called it a digital cleanup day, or some people kind of
That
call it
was it.
yeah, digital decluttering. And there is an annual international day in March that maybe is a good thing to start working towards, which encourages people to kind of do that digital cleanup. We are storing kind of increasing mountains of data, and of course, the AI relies on these mountains of data for training purposes and whatever. But I think we've become quite casual about storing, not deleting photos, video, all sorts of files that have like all sorts of very large files that we don't necessarily need to keep, and we end up just storing them for ages because we don't necessarily have good practice around that. And actually, if everybody took a bit of responsibility for doing that, whilst obviously, being really clear about the records that we need to keep and whatever, then I think that, that could make a big difference. I can't put a number on it, but I feel like it's something that, we could see more people adopting. And, in the days when archiving and storage was actually, physical, the key practice of archiving was figuring out what is it that, not what to keep, but what to get rid of. Archiving is a practice of thinking about, okay, well, we don't need this anymore. We can forget this. And that's as important as thinking about what is it that you're going to keep. So I do think those kinds of things can make a huge difference. And there's lots of, there's so much. I loved your example of ways in which you can automate the systems, like the email system. There are loads of examples like this as well that I've, a really small one, but that I've realized recently is if you take a transcript from some video conferencing services, so things like, I sometimes take a Teams transcript on Microsoft Teams, and the size of those files is enormous. And what I've realized now is if I save it as a text file, because that's all I need, I only need the text, not all the kind of hidden metadata and whatever within it. It reduces the size of the file by about 99%. It's yeah. So there's lots of redundancy and lots of obsolescence built into our systems, and actually, and if you are a small organization, if you're a small charity, or actually probably all this storage is costing you quite a lot of money as well, potentially. So there's a financial benefit to just sitting down and having a bit of a clear out, every so often as well. You might actually find that it has a cost saving as well as an environmental saving.
Yeah, it's so helpful. And I think those practical things are really useful because so many organizations, they want to be able to have something practical they can start doing. So that's something really, really helpful. It would be really good, though, to hear about some positive use cases for AI. So either within Friends of the Earth or other environmental initiatives that you've come across. Could you share some of the positive or potentially positive use cases?
Yeah. I think some of the most interesting positive use cases for AI are probably the ones that people have been using for quite a while and didn't necessarily think about as AI, because it's only when people starting using, generative AI that somehow this has become a bit more in people's consciousness. But one of my favorites that I've been using for a long time are some of the kind of nature identification apps. So things like Merlin for identifying bird songs, and that might be one that people know, or iNaturalist which is an app that basically uses photos to help you identify mostly plant species. Those things are incredibly valuable. They're basically using kind of AI pattern matching. I've learnt so much about the wildlife around me. I've been able to identify rare birds in my neighborhood that I didn't know were there and that I can't see just because I've heard a call and thought, what was that? I think that's incredible. That opens me up an incredible window on the world. And then in terms of actually practical kind of organizational uses, I'm sure a lot of listeners will be very familiar with Tech for Good Southwest's kind of living lab pilots. But I think, for example, what the Centre for Sustainable Energy are doing in prototyping a chat bot that might help them with their retrofit service, so they can focus their advice on energy efficiency and energy saving on either kind of cases that are a bit more complicated, working more with vulnerable people, but actually really, really prioritizing those cases where they really need that kind of human input. But actually, that means also they can do more with the resources they've got. I think again, that's a great example. Within Friends of the Earth, one of the ways we've been trying to think about AI is thinking about, okay, well, where might we be experiencing bottlenecks in terms of, the limits on what we can do, and are there ways in which AI can help address those bottlenecks, particularly if they're sort of, desk-based bottlenecks. So just taking examples from, my own kind of innovation team and from kind of our sort of experimental practice, because I think it's better to speak to kind of, the experience of me and my immediate colleagues rather than kind of more widely. Things like, things that we would never have been able to do before, but actually can do very quickly to bring an idea to life. Like we do occasionally use image generation for storyboarding, for example. Now, we'd never use that with an external audience, but actually if we're trying to show, okay, here's like here's a concept that we want to bring to life, and and it's not something we would previously have used a graphic designer for or something. It's something where probably I'd have had to spend half an afternoon with my pretty patchy sketching skills trying to draw something out to try and make something come to life. It's no, that's not necessarily my strongest suit. And actually now I can generate a storyboard that I can put in front of someone that can be like, look, this is what the user experience of this would be like if we went down this approach. What do you think of it? What do you make of it? So that's an example of a bottleneck where we can move through to prototyping kind of much more quickly in quite an exciting way. And there are some parallels as well around kind of unblocking a kind of bottleneck around researching new topics, for example. So we have been using Perplexity a little bit for kind of researching new topics, understanding a field, who's already working in this area, what are they doing, what are good examples, are there examples of practice from elsewhere in the world. Now obviously we could do that using more traditional Google searches and literature reviews and whatever, but the time saving is massive, and we'd never then take that at face value. We'd always then go away and check out the links, make sure the links really are what they say they are. And again, it's for kind of internal purposes only, but something that might have taken us, a week, we can now pull together in an afternoon, for example. So I think in terms of um, there are productivity benefits in some areas when used mindfully, but I do think we need to approach all of these with caution. And I come back to the kind of organizational values around really being confident about the facts. There are examples of kind of valuable internal usage, and there are examples, I think, a couple that I've just shared, of where AI is really being supporting the delivery of kind of public facing projects, like with the Centers for Sustainable Energy. And I suppose it's kind of a final case, which is probably not one that's so relevant to sort of small organizations, but one of the things I also love as an application is, I think I said, AI is brilliant at kind of pattern spotting, and there are some fantastic examples of people using AI to do things like identify areas where they think illegal deforestation might be taking place, illegal waste dumps, those kinds of things. Again, they almost always need kind of checking out and ground truthing. There might be something, it might not be quite what it looks like. So that's incredibly powerful. And actually the potential the potential of AI use in those use cases for actually delivering a kind of cleaner, healthier environment of focusing enforcement resources where they're really needed, I think is really exciting.
Yeah, and I think it was really important to talk about these like exciting potential developments as well. And I think, that's why it's also so important that charities, third sector, socially focused organizations actually do this work, because actually we are the organizations that are going to hopefully going to be able to explore how this can be used for good as a technology. And really this takes me on to the point, and you've mentioned it a few times, around advocacy. So at Tech for Good Southwest, we have a network of organizations passionate about using technology for positive impact. And you have talked about how the responsibility to use AI ethically and sustainably is often pushed onto these individual organizations, but really we should be pushing back on those people with power. You have spoken already about things that we can do, like start asking, if in terms of procurement. But are there other things that we can do? Like, what role do you think networks like ours can play in this collective advocacy piece around AI in environmental justice?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, it's one that at Friends of the Earth, we are still a little bit trying to work through, and talking to those other organisations who we think are doing really important work in this area. I mean, I'd highlight the work of an organisation like Global Action Plan. Look them up if you don't know them. Global Action Plan have been working for a long time on the interface between kind of big tech and the climate crisis. They're currently leading a legal challenge with a campaigning organisation called Foxglove, about a hyperscale data center in Buckinghamshire, but mainly about the government's the local authorities' failure to conduct a proper environmental impact assessment. So, there's trying to figure out actually what we can all do as networks and so on in this space is as part of what we're thinking about at the moment. What are the different roles that people can play? I would say that beyond some of those questions around kind of procurement, I think there are also questions that we can be asking of our local authorities, of our local planning authorities. And that's why it's interesting that you've got a network like kind of Tech for Good Southwest that is actually place based. So what do we know about what is the infrastructure that's planned, you know, in the Southwest? What do we know about that? Um, what do we know about kind of what's coming through? Are there likely to be any kind of, AI growth zones? What have they said about what do we know? What of the local water? What do the local water companies think about this? If they got a view, where's the energy actually coming from? So first of all, like trying to understand, perhaps build a collective picture of what is the situation here. I think is really useful, and actually then starting to ask some of those questions of your whether that's of your local, depending on the issue, whether that's of your local council or that might actually be of the regional mayor, because the regional mayors have responsibility for the regional mayors have particular responsibility for economic development and so on. Asking them how are they ensuring that um, that development that is coming through is still going to be in line with climate targets, carbon budgets, and so on. And importantly, actually, very importantly, we have ambitious goals around kind of 30% of managing 30% of our land for nature by 2030. So how are we making sure that actually, again, that data center and this infrastructure is contributing towards those goals. Um, in sometimes data centers aren't that it's not always that easy to spot them in planning applications. So one thing that we've observed is that planning applications, when you see applications of data centers coming through, often they are initially labeled as under a particular category, which is called storage and distribution. So you can't necessarily tell initially what's a warehouse and what's a warehouse and what's a data center in a planning application. So actually, there's a question. I think we can ask questions of you can ask questions of your local councillors, particularly if they sit on the planning committee. Is what sort of applications are coming through and how are you assessing them and what information are you asking for? Um, I think that that's a kind of, if you like, a role that individual members as citizens can play. I also think that actually it's really, really important to keep these questions on the table and really live. And that's part of our advocacy role too. So a couple of weeks ago, it was Bristol Tech Festival. And there's lots of hype and lots of excitement about all sorts of exciting, innovations, including lots of AI-based innovations. And I actually feel that even kind of compared to last year, there was a little bit less about kind of the environmental kind of impact or the social impact of some of these technologies as well. I mean, I saw some. I went to a showcase and I saw some technologies that, to my mind, were pretty alarming around kind of facial recognition technology, for example, which without the right safeguards, very very quickly becomes a surveillance technology. And a surveillance technology that is directed at those, it is often directed at the most marginalized groups in our society as well. So, we really need to kind of keep asking these questions about actually what is this for? What are the trade-offs? Are the benefits worth the cost? And actually just keep being that voice, something a network like Tech for Good can occupy this narrative space that is somewhere in between, that yeah, that has kind of a positive vision for how these things can be used, but also brings a conscience into these spaces, I think. Because we are all values led and we can bring those values in. And I think we shouldn't be shy of asking those questions, and we shouldn't somehow feel like, that it's kind of a stupid question if we're asking it. If we don't know the answers around environmental impact, or you feel that people aren't being clear about them, then we should have the confidence in those spaces to stand up and ask those questions.
Thank you so much, and such important, valuable questions for us to keep in mind and to keep asking. Um, it is the Tech for Good Southwest podcast, so we always ask, what does Tech for Good mean to you?
So for me, tech for good means technology that well, I think it means harnessing the liberatory potential of technology, right? So how can we it's technology that enables us to be more fully human, to be more fully alive in the world, to experience the the living world around us more fully, and to enable everyone to kind of to develop their potential. And and liberatory technology will mean different things for different people. For some people it will be technology that enables them to kind of overcome barriers that they might have to engagement, with all sorts of with the world in all sorts of ways. And for some people it will just be actually that technology that enables them to step more fully into their humanity. But I think that's what tech for good means to me. It means unlocking that kind of liberatory potential.
Wow, it's such an amazing answer, and like it's just been great talking to you. You have so much knowledge and experience to share, and it's so relevant. I think I said when we first met, it was quite exciting because I work with lots of charities and third sector organizations, and we've already been pointing them to your report, which is just really excellent because I think that we are trying to all work things out, and having that expertise that you can share and that you're sharing so freely now is just really, really helpful. Yeah, so just massively grateful. I know this is going to be really useful to so many organizations. Um, Finally, then, where should organizations look for guidance if they want to be responsible in this space or just, carrying on following this work that you're doing? How do we learn more?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, one of the first places to look is our report, we're going to be publishing some new resources quite soon as well. Probably a policy position piece on data centers from Friends of the Earth. That'll be a national piece rather than just kind of Southwest based. But hopefully that will provide some more specifics on some of these questions in relation to the UK. I mean, I often direct people towards, and I'm sure you have in the past as well, towards the resources that are available through CAST. They've got a really good AI resources kind of page, and their digital leads network has also produced some really good resources on AI. So I think that's a good place to go. Um, we're also founder members of something called the Innovation for Impact Network, which is actually a network primarily of international NGOs. It includes people like WWF, Amnesty International, internationally. And we've produced some additional resources on kind of AI in the NGO and kind of charity sector. So that's another place to go and look. Um, and I always, I can't recommend strongly enough the what's available through the Green Web Foundation. I think they do amazing work and have some amazing resources, including a guide that explores a little bit more how you can dive into these procurement questions. What are the questions you can really ask? Um, and finally, I would say, we were signatories on a civil society statement back in February, um, developed by something called the Green Screen Coalition, who again have loads of amazing resources, work quite a lot with the Green Web Foundation. And they produced this, we as a coalition produced this statement called Within Bounds about AI within planetary boundaries. And I think that is still for me the clearest articulation of what is the kind of technology that we need and that we should be advocating for.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. And thank you for talking to me today. It's been absolutely amazing to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me.